Well, hello again everyone, it's Jim Lynn here. Welcome to episode 25 of Mr. Lynn's Workshop. At the classic hand tools stand at the Harrogate show last November, I was able to pick up quite a few items that were once in David Charlesworth's workshop. I was particularly interested in these, David's modified marking gauge. Now, why would you modify a marking gauge? Well, David's logic was that if you're working on a project, it might be very useful to have quite a number of marking gauges with their settings preserved so you can keep going back to them. Now, of course, marking gauges can be expensive, and David was anxious to keep costs down for his students. So he came up with the idea of modifying this cheap marking gauge. Now, this only cost me £6 a couple of months ago. And by modifying it, he found that you could make a significant improvement to the performance. So with some instructions that I found in David Charlesworth's first book, and two of David's gauges to use as patterns and examples, and with several unmodified brand new gauges to practice on, we've got everything we need to make our own David Charlesworth modified marking gauge. But before we start, let's have a look at why modifying it is necessary in the first place. For a long time I've been using two Veritas marking gauges, and this is their micro adjustable version. There's good contact between the brass face of the wheel and your work, so it's very stable. Also, having a cutting wheel, it doesn't follow the grain when you're marking long grain, and cuts well across the grain, especially if you roll it. The other gauge I like to use is Veritas's double marking gauge. Now again, there's good contact between the brass face of the gauge and your work, so it's stable. Also, with having two rods, you can either adjust them together using the little clamp at the tail end of the rods, or with that slackened you can adjust each rod separately. So with the combination of this gauge and the micro adjustable gauge, I can have up to 3 marking gauge settings preserved. Another advantage of this particular gauge is that one of the cutter wheels has its bevel on the right and the others on the left, and that can be useful sometimes. This is the cheap marking gauge that we're going to be modifying. Now it's made of beech, so it's quite a good wood. It's also reasonably well made. At the very least it's a good starting point for our task here. It has a hardened pin, not a cutter, so it's going to scratch the wood, not cut it. Now the disadvantage of that is that as it scratches, it can follow the grain if you're not careful, and it sounds and feels terrible across the grain. Now the biggest disadvantage of this gauge, and in fact the reason for modifying it, is that you can't actually see the pin when you're marking, so it's very difficult to know where to start. So David's idea was to combine the advantages of the wheel gauge, that is a cutter rather than a pin, and good visibility, but with much reduced cost, and there's the added bonus of gaining some tool making skills. The main task is to turn the pin into a knife, and to do that we need to remove it from the stem. I just used my little vise to do that. It comes off quite easily. Here I'm making a mark 28mm from the thick end of the pin. Then I force the pin back into the hole it came out of just to hold it securely. Then I use my card file to score a line at the black mark I made earlier. It's back to the vise to hold the tip securely so that I can snap it off. I cleaned that tip up with my diamond card file, and then the next step is to make a mark, say 4 or 5mm in from that end. Now I need to remove half the pin. So here I'm using my fingernail as a fence just to get the cut started, and I'm using the coarse diamond file, keeping it horizontal in 2 dimensions. After a while the diamond file jigs itself, so you don't need to use your fingernail anymore. Just keep going at this until you've removed half the pin. It takes about half an hour. I think that's about half the pin removed, so now I can start using the medium file and then finally the fine file to get a good finish. Having created that flat, I now need to work on the opposite side of the pin. Now, so that I can use the same hand in the same clamping setup, I just turn the pin 180 degrees using the vise. So this is my clamping setup. The two holdfasts to the right are just holding a large piece of ply, and that's just to apply pressure to the small piece of ply with the V-notch cut in it. The main pressure on the stem is with this holdfast that I'm hitting now. The V-notch just stops the stem rotating left and right as we work. Now, with everything securely set, I use the file to reference the face we've already cut and make a mark on the side that we're about to work. And there's the fingertip fence again. This time we're not filing horizontally, we're following the slope of the pin. Here commences the part of the video where I deliberately, on purpose, no word of a lie, didn't have any sound in this particular clip, and that's just to spare you the chalk against blackboard experience of diamonds against metal. In fact, the battery in the microphone ran out and I didn't realise. Here's the result so far. Both flats together create this thin little rectangular section at the tip of the pin. That's what we want. Now the second flat, I didn't work up the grits because we're not finished with that yet. Let's have a look at this diagram. Step 1 was snapping off the tip of the pin because we don't need that. Step 2 was filing parallel to the axis of the pin so that we end up with this half moon cross section. Step 3 was filing along the slope of the pin so that we create this kind of chisel type cross section. Step 4 is where we form the knife edge by creating a sharpening bevel of 35 degrees on each side, and finally step 5 just rounds the tip to make the knife complete. Now I want to keep the hold down setup I've got, and I also want to keep filing horizontally, so that means in order for the pin to see 35 degrees I have to twist it in the stem. Here you can see the pin clearly sitting at a different angle than it was before. Looks a bit more severe than 35 degrees, but maybe it is. It doesn't really matter as long as it's close enough. As always, we mark up again with a marker pen so that we can check our progress, and then using our finger as a fence we can start filing. So here I'm filing horizontally fore and aft, but I've got a slight downward slope away from my fingertip to follow that original slope of the tip of the pin. When the beveled edge and the underside edge meet, you're done with the coarse file. You can then move up to the medium file and finally the fine file to finish off and get a sharp edge. Here's what it looks like after the first 35-degree bevel has been created. Now we need to adjust the position of the pin so that we can do the other 35-degree bevel. Now, in order to keep all this straight in my mind, I like to begin by putting the pin and the stem back in the vise in the orientation at which it came out, and then move the stem back to the neutral position. Then, after resetting the protractor, I can move the stem 35 degrees in the other direction. Now we simply repeat the previous process, working our way through our grits from coarse, medium to fine, so that we create our second 35-degree bevel. Now I just use the medium file and then the fine file to work the tip so that it's more or less 35 degrees. Remember, the important thing that we're looking for is a good sharp edge all the way around. And this is the finished article, a sharpened pointed pin converted to a little knife. Now we can pull the pin out of the stem and put it away in a safe place for later. The next task is to create the notch in the stem through which the tip of the pin will protrude. You can see here on David's marking gauge that what he did was to remove the pin and reposition it 100 degrees anti-clockwise around the stem so that the tip protrudes from one of the stem corners. In the book, David said he used chisels and a file to cut the notch. I thought I would use my gouge, but I couldn't find it initially, so I too resorted to some chisels. This is the prototype I made in preparation for this video, and it shows that if you don't have a gouge or even files, you can still get a good notch with just a few chisels. At this point we need to do some marking out. We need layout lines on the end of the stem to guide us when we're drilling the hole for the pin, and also some other lines on the stem itself for that notch that we're going to cut. With one end of the stem held securely in the vise, I've positioned the stalk so that its main face is flush with the end of the stem. This means that I can use the lower edge of the stalk as my main reference surface for marking out. This is our reference line for the pin. We want the pin to exit the stem at that top left corner. Next we need a reference line for our notch. Now the slope of the notch is orthogonal to the pin, so that's what I'm marking out here. We need to transfer the notch layout lines round to the sides. This will define our entry and exit points when we're cutting the notch. Finally, we'll mark the centre line of the notch about 10mm in from the end of the stem. I found my gouge, so I'm going to use that to cut this notch. I'm going to be cutting the notch from the other side, so the first thing to do is to make a release cut on this side. Note how I'm keeping the gouge aligned with my reference line on the end of the stem. Starting at the exit edge and with the gouge on the centre line and aligned with my layout line on the end of the stem, I'm just taking small bites at this to keep control. I'm holding the gouge quite firmly with my left hand, and I've got my knuckle pressed up against the stem, so there's good pressure there, and then a little wiggling motion progresses the gouge through the material. If you try to take too big a bite, I also realised I didn't take my release cut right up to the edge, so now I've got a little bit of spelching. Well, this turned out really well. I found that using the gouge was a lot quicker and easier and gave a cleaner, crisper finish than the chisels that I used whilst making the prototype. Now it's time to drill the hole for the pin. Now David recommends that the diameter of the drill bit should be 0.2mm less than the diameter of the pin. This will ensure a good tight friction fit. Here the pin is 2.36mm. and the drill I bought especially is 2.16mm, ideal. I'm using my hand cranked pillar drill to drill this hole. Now the blue vise holds the stem at the correct angle, adjusted by moving the leftmost strip of wood, and it's all positioned so that the notch in the stem is within swing range of the body of the pillar drill. So this is how it works. Because the drill bit is vertical, I adjust the blue vise so that my pin layout line is vertical too. The little square helps with this. Next, I swing the pillar drill body so that the drill bit is aligned with the layout line. Now I can raise the drill bit and slide the blue vise towards me so that the drill bit is over the spot in the notch where I'm going to drill. Feed rate is tricky to get right with this pillar drill, and you need both hands to do it, so it does help if you clamp everything down much more securely than I've done here. This movement didn't happen when I made the prototype, but I'll sort it out when I do the next one. It didn't seem to cause any problems though. A little bit of burnishing and we're done. Fitting the pin into the stem is quite straightforward, but it is a tight fit, and I found I could only get it so far pushing against the bench, and it was marking the bench. So this is where the blue vise came in handy as a press. The tip of the pin should protrude no more than 2 to 3 millimeters. With the tail of the pin held securely in the vise, we can now adjust the orientation of the knife. Now, whether the bevel side faces in or out, the flat face of the knife should always be aligned at a slight angle. It's very small, less than 1 degree, and open to the direction of travel. The reason for this is to ensure that the stock of the marking gauge is pulled tight to the work as we push the gauge along. Now this adjusting can be fiddly as it's such a tiny angle, and so you might have to go back and forth between the vise and the testing piece until you get it to feel right. The yellow thumb screw definitely needs some work. In its untouched state it's quite grindy and jerky to turn, and this is because it's quite crudely moulded. The two halves of the mould obviously weren't perfectly aligned, as there is a significant amount of flash along the join. All this flash is easily removed with a sharp blade. I smoothed off the end as well. This will help with securing the stem tightly and cut down on any indentations. The final task is to cut a little mortise or recess in the stock to house the pin. There's two reasons for this. It enables zero clearance between knife edge and stock, but more importantly it protects the knife when it's in your toolbox. First, I make two marks to define the extremities of the recess. Then I take the chisel I'm going to use to cut the recess and use that as a template to define the width. This is a 3mm chisel. Mark the edges with a marking knife. Mark the ends of the recess with the chisel. Now we can start removing the waste with the chisel held bevel down. Keeping the face of the bevel parallel to the face of the stock will give us a nice flat bottom in the recess. Now that we've started, we can use a larger chisel to more clearly define the recessed sides. Notice I've got a raising block in the vise under the stock to provide good support. Finally, we can use the block plane to ease all those sharp edges on the stock and the stem. We just want the whole thing to feel good while we're using it. I finished up with some Skelton's peacock wax on the sliding faces. In these stills of the finished modified marking gauge, the W reminds me which side of the knife is the waste side, and in this picture it's clear just how much we've improved visibility of the knife tip. Well, I'm well pleased with that. It's a satisfying wee project this, and it allows us to get some practice in at some of our more delicate skills. I would say it should take a couple of hours to make the knife and another couple of hours to make everything else, but it's time well spent to get such a useful precision tool for very little outlay. So why not have a go and let us know how you get on in the comments. Well, that's it for this episode, everyone. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time on Mr. Lynn's Workshop.